So, great. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unfold's lecture series. Apologies that we are a bit late. It's the last week of term and a bit hectic. And thank you all for joining us, here and also online. So this is the last lecture this term, and we are very happy that you are again all here with us. We know how busy you are. So some of us here in person, and others are joining us online. Others will watch the recording later. So we have a wonderful speaker with us here today, Anooradha Iyer Siddiqi for Bernard College and Columbia University, who will talk about her new book, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab refugee camps and humanitarian settlements. I'm not sure where to look, whether to you or, or to you, or yeah. And the book was published by Duke University Press. After the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A, so please stay with us online and here. So just before introducing the talk and the speaker, for those who are here with us for the first time, just to mention and reflect that in Unfold, we seek to indeed unfold spaces, voices, histories, pedagogies, and practices in the effort to decolonize architecture through new areas and forms of discussion. We try not only to change the essence of the conversation, but actually also the terms of the conversation in which we hope to know from elsewhere. And knowing from elsewhere, it's not only from different locations, and we had talks about different locations. Today, it will be mainly about the context of Kenya, but also from different forms of creating, teaching, researching, and inhabiting our built world. We aim to bring together scholars, architects, educators, and activists that could prompt us to rethink what architecture means and what it must include. And this includes the call to end all forms of injustice and violence that today violate so many people and spaces, including places like Gaza, the Ukraine, and elsewhere. Anooradha's work is very much relevant for this, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation and discussion today. So Anooradha is a global expert on the relationship between architecture and the social politics of injustice. Her scholarship includes the book she'll discuss today, Architecture of Migration, and also the book Spatial Violence with Andrew Hersher, and many other publications as well. Her work foregrounds histories of marginalized figures and excluded communities, and promote practices of collaboration and support, primarily through examining diverse forms of aesthetic practice and cultural production, and we'll hear about it more today. So I'm so happy to have Anu here with us today. Our paths have crossed many times by now, and we really have the honor that you are here today and to hear about your work. So please join me in welcoming Anooradha for her talk.
Hi, everyone on the screen. Is this the right place to stand, or?
Yes.
The only people I can't see are those of you in the room. I could look at you through that. Thank you so much, Edith, for that really warm welcome. And thanks actually for just inviting me to be here. I've been watching this series from afar, and it's just so exciting to be here and kind of get to know a little bit about what you're trying to do. I wanted to sort of begin with a few acknowledgements. First of all, to all of you and all of you for your interest. I want to actually begin with acknowledgements that maybe will provide a kind of discursive landscape for the book. And I have to always begin when I talk about this book to thank my parents. And I think those of us who work in parts of the world that teach us the ways that we are complicit in crime make us really thankful for those who raised us and those who take care of us on a daily basis. So I think of my family, but I also think of elders and communities in Dadaab and in refugee camps around the world who really have much to teach. I also often think about all the invisible laborers who make it possible for us to do our academic work, from those who clean these rooms to those who administer various things that make it possible for us to share research. The book itself depended on a lot of different scholarship, and your professor's scholarship is among that, but I'd like to start by thanking two scholars whose assessments grace the back cover of the book. Mabel Wilson, who laid the ground for an understanding of architectural history within theoretical frameworks of Blackness, a global Africa, critical theories of race. Miriam Tickton, whose anthropological concern for the double-edged politics of care and the material and sensual habitats of border worlds helps us to understand histories and possibilities for commoning, what a feminist commons might look like. I'm really very grateful to some of my earliest advisors, Jean-Louis Cohen, Sally Engel-Mary, Thomas Keenan. They helped me understand leftist architectural histories, spatial politics, the politics of aesthetics, anthropologies and cultural studies of human rights. And I would also like to cite my long-term collaborators who each informed different chapters of the book. Bazira Zomindar on partitions, Holly Amber Kennedy on settlement, Rachel Lee on collaborations, and the artists and intellectuals at the Go Down Art Center in Nairobi, who have grounded and expanded my perspective. And very soon there will be an exhibition at the Go Down that draws from some of the work in this book. I met Irit together with Romola Sanyal years ago. Both of their work has really impacted my view tremendously. I thought we met at a symposium, but we might have met many times before then. But I mentioned this symposium because the organizers developed a book called Inhabiting Displacement that hopefully you already know, but if you don't, I think this is a book that would really be important for all of you to read. And I'm mentioning this landscape of people, and they are scholars, but they're also people, because I've just been counting my lucky stars that I have these people in my own mental landscape as interlocutors for this book. Our work in many ways diverges, but I think what has been exciting is just understanding that we can have a robust sense of both solidarity and difference. So I say that because many students might be listening, and it's important to really understand that the things that you have in common and the things that you have in difference are both equally meaningful for your scholarship. My book grew out of art historical frameworks, and it really proposes a humanistic and an aesthetic study of migration. It's an art historical platform that it provides a sort of counterpoint to the more frequent social scientific or policy frameworks by underpinning a discussion that's predicated not on the control or regulation of migration, which is the typical framework for understanding and seeing migration, but on the principle of open migration. Open migration is often harder to see and thus harder to study from the perspective of art or architecture. So the book begins with the claim that a refugee camp is not an object. I came to Dadaab first and foremost as an art and architectural historian, asking, what do we learn when we look closely at a refugee camp? What does its architecture trace? While this question of representation is not the book's only interrogation, it's the one that unlocks others. The term architecture can imply an aesthetic regard at the expense of exigent human need, but I've tried to argue for a different kind of urgency, one that has to do with the direct entanglement of aesthetics with politics. This book reverses the conceptual terms in which architecture is allocated to the subsidiary position of signifying a political framework, and instead it argues that constructed environments and spatial practices act to construct political subjecthood and historical consciousness. My book brings into focus spatial and material histories related to one set of refugee settlements, from which we can draw many other concept histories. In 1991, near the village of Dadaab, Kenya, Close to the border with Somalia, the UNHCR initiated an emergency intervention, a relief operation in the form of a temporary encampment into which by now 3 generations of people have been born. Its remarkable scale of operations as a humanitarian site was brought about by the mass confinement of people by the state. The modular design of the settlements for flexibility and expansion into perpetuity speaks to the transformation of an emergency into a state of emergency. This transformation can be understood as a material mirroring of the breakdown of the government of Somalia, at once signaling the sunset of the ideology of the liberal nation state, as well as the overt grafting of the putatively liberal entity of citizenship onto the coercive system of the security state. So while my book examines some of these, let's say, big histories, I do so by following individuals, people who have lived and worked in Dadaab, refugees and aid workers who together constructed the camps. This book sees them as architects and their work as an architecture of migration. The camps they've designed and constructed are a racialized architecture, yet they inscribe complex African ways of knowing based fundamentally on migration rather than fixity. My book analyzes the ways we can understand this complexity and how it provides us with historical and aesthetic knowledge. We can understand this through the very basic exercise of studying 2 produced images of the same architecture. This one, commissioned, it's an aerial photographic survey team that was commissioned by the UNHCR to produce demographic maps to calculate humanitarian need, yet amounting to a kind of sanctioned surveillance. And this one produced as part of a body of concerned photojournalism. Both of these images are equally beguiling. And this one operates beyond visual witnessing or testimony toward aesthetic registers that tell a very different story than the bird's eye view and even engage the networks of art museums. This image speaks of dwellings that embody generational knowledge, the East African tukul, whose habitation of the land has been deformed. The pastoral economy and its reliance on the abundance of land and water resources for the raising of animals would disallow the zoning and aggregation of these tukuls in this way. The examination of the tukul in different analyses in multiple chapters of this book is a close look at a gendered and mobile architecture, a recalcitrant architecture that refuses to comply with civil code, civil infrastructure, but offers its own migratory archive and episteme as the primary architecture in the camps. This book works against the putative fixity of architecture and the certainty imputed to the landed archive, and instead it insists on migration as its own form of knowledge. So I would ask you to please pause and think on how this architecture might or might not appear in the official archive. It's the most significant structure in the region, tied to a rich aesthetic history of building traditions, cultural expression, yet it might only be remarked on in passing by a British officer in a military memo or a humanitarian aid worker's notes for site selection for a refugee camp. So please also note the violence of this dismissal from historical and architectural value. On violence, I examine in the Dadaab refugee camps an architecture that its residents have called an open-air prison, which at once has constricted movement and sedentarized people, yet also iterates longer migratory lifeways and thinking, longer traditions. Thinking with the Dadaab refugee camps allows us to imagine and emplace the wider landscape of migration, regional and global, present and past, which takes form in the Kenya-Somalia borderland. My book offers a concept history that uses these camps and the condition of migration as a method to study settlement. Through the architecture of camps, I examine a long regional and global history of what I've come to understand as humanitarian settlement. This paradox of settlement in the precise moment of emergency becomes apprehensible in the infrastructures of designing and making of the significant constructed environment of Dadaab, but I also extrapolate that to understand the making of precedent environments. And the precedents I explore in the book include liberatory and coercive settlements in East Africa. The putatively liberatory abolitionist settlement of Freertown, pictured here, established in 1875 near the coastal town of Mombasa, at that time a town, we would call it something else today, I think. It was established to house people who had escaped or been liberated from enslavement in the Indian Ocean. And it became a social crucible in the 19th century in which Africans, Asians, and Europeans exchanged. Freertown was predicated on the settlement of African land. It entangled rescuer and rescued in the enclosure of a Christian mission that equated the cultivation of plots with a moral life. The coercive settlements that form another precedent for Dadaab are the so-called Shifta villages in which pastoralists were detained, many whose descendants themselves ended up confined in the Dadaab camps, unable to move freely, to seek education, or to work, and living wholly dependent upon aid. The detainment strategy of the Shifta wars, and this term Shifta is an Amharic term that means bandit, and it's used pejoratively by the Kenyan government, though it's counter-appropriated, I think, by young people today in a more positive way. But these wars nearly annihilated an entire pastoral way of life. Of course, these settlement forms find their own precedent in the detention manyatas, or the villages that you see in this photograph here for anti-colonial Mau Mau. This is a declassified photo held for many years by the British government. In some cases, the very officers in the Imperial British Army who implemented these detention and labor camps to hold Kenyans were seconded to the newly independent Kenyan government to develop military strategies to detain the pastoralists from the Northeast, which is the area where Dadaab is located. So this long history of detainment and settlement, of forced migration and forced settlement, is also a long story of the eradication of migratory ways of life and the continuous sedentarization of people in enclosures, especially people who relate to the land through migratory means, who live on the land rather than off it. In this way, the book is fundamentally a meditation on architecture's relationship to land. By examining the paradox of humanitarian settlement, it holds land politics at its center. Dadaab's historical particularity comes from connections to striking spatial forms developed and expressed over centuries, retaining embedded knowledge. However, it also comes from significant recent trajectories of spatial practice within the post-World War II international system of development and humanitarian aid. The singularity and iconic role of the Dadaab refugee complex in the history of the international aid system belies its appearance as a provisional environment, constructed only to respond to emergency. Another story is told by its concrete local and global infrastructures, as well as designed architectures such as this and this, each part of initiatives undertaken by NGOs, the former by the Norwegian Refugee Council, and the latter by the UNHCR and International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. These architectures and their meanings are explored within a series of design histories in the book that consider the irony of signature practices of design embedded within emergency relief as a function of design itself, acting as a kind of infrastructure. Now, historically, more than any other emergency environment, Dadaab has functioned as a significant duty station for institutionally trained architects, arriving from around the world to work as physical planners and enabling important experiments in architecture and spatial practice. Through Dadaab, the book explores shelter design initiatives as signature practices by NGOs, which paradoxically provided forms of patriarchal rescue while containing and scaffolding insurgent forms of domesticity in emergency. While the book examines that embedded life of architecture, it also shows how the structure of the complex of settlements iterates decades of emergency relief and physical planning expertise, providing a test bed for design and spatial practice implemented worldwide. For example, in the contemporary well-known Al-Zatari camps for Syrian refugees, often discussed in terms of their design. Dadaab has thus played a significant part in a global history of architecture and an international field of humanitarian practice. And I was mentioning before the talk that one of the sort of most significant actors in this is Tom Corsellis, who founded the Shelter Center, I believe, in the back of this building when he was not an architecture student. He might have been on the faculty at that time. But I think it's initiatives like that had not been consolidated internationally, but were kind of independent initiatives that really, I think, form the backbone of this history. This drawing that you see on the screen is the very first, I guess, drawing made by an architect of Dadaab, and it's by an architect who was commissioned to plan one of the camps. This is a drawing of Ifo camp, the very first settlement, and he was commissioned to design another one or plan another one. I would say that it's one of the first documents ever made of the architecture of Dadaab. So in gathering this, literally from this architect's house in Sweden, as well as several other documents, I constructed an archive of a provisional environment, in part to demonstrate how it could be done. I've presented this and other documents in other talks, and people have commented about how, oh, it's amazing that you have so much literature on Dadaab. And I always think this is such a funny thing to notice because it looks like a lot when someone's gathered it. But if I tell you the stories of the many years of travels around the world to people's homes, to very strange little institutions, to find these things, it would not sound quite as consolidated. But I think that what's important is a demonstration that any environment can be a source of a kind of history. It's really up to the historian to be willing to see those things and find those things. And, we can talk more about this if this is of interest to all of you. So the UNHCR, I think in talking about Dadaab, it's really important to note this policy of the UNHCR, which is to classify sensitive documents for 20 years. So Dadaab was established in 1991, and I began studying it in 2010. So at that time, its documents were all still classified. And this is a period that is intended to outlast the life of a crisis or of a humanitarian operation. And of course, we all know that enumeration is untrue. But I found that some of the records that were not classified, they were not deemed sensitive, they were not deemed, I guess, politically sensitive, were highly sensitive in another sense. I mean, aesthetically, shall we say. These were all reports by architects, professionals who are trained in aesthetic matters, quite different from the utilitarian aims for an emergency response. Among many sorts of artifacts, I gathered architects' drawings and aid workers' videotapes. This very faded document leading to the establishment of the camps, this is a nearly illegible fax transmission from UNHCR Nairobi to Geneva headquarters, warning of the amassing of people at the border with Somalia in 1991 and calling for the construction of a settlement. Archival images of food distribution centers, which are the core and the most charged space in a refugee camp. My own photographs from more recent food distribution centers and other built environments of Dadaab. The publication of these materials casts the book itself as an archive. And I see this archival work as a bridge for the many people for whom Dadaab is or has been home to find and articulate their own histories and to exercise their own historical consciousness as and when they wish. A very exciting piece of news is I almost want to, we have to knock wood as we say this, but this has been brewing that the Kenyan government is effectively shifting its policy from asylum seeking to integrated settlement. I think that what that means is that we will suddenly see a massive decline in human trafficking. We'll really see a kind of border abolition in our time. They think this is going to happen this year itself. This has been in the works, and it's mind-blowing for those of us who have been watching Dadaab for a long time. So it makes me very happy to think that a book like this about a place that has been contained will in a way be a different kind of document even a year from now, because that place won't have to be what it has been for this, almost 30 years. So one of the other ways that I tested an engagement with architecture and history was to invite several artists to, as I put it, to draw Dadaab. And, this is, I felt that, if many people write a book and then you write the book and you get to be the expert and that's it, you're just sort of done. And I felt like the arguments in this book, in the spirit of decolonizing architecture, were really about, if the arguments held, then someone else with their own developed practice should be able to take the arguments and make something of them, follow them through on their own terms. And I think I got this idea from my friend Deka Abshir, who is the artist who made this work. I happened to find this work in the late stages of writing the book, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's the cover of my book. But more than that, I really, as I came to know her own studies, what she was really looking at, she was considering these traditional East African shelters, these tukuls, and against Somali practices of homemaking and form making. For her, as she has narrated and as I've learned about the making of tukuls, it's a tradition that's passed down by women in coming of age rituals. It consolidates generations of knowledge in the built environment, even in the camps. So she examines the tukul, which is an object that she describes as having transformed from a symbol of tradition to one of refugee life, by depicting it in fragments in this mixed media painting. And it's a painting and collage on canvas. It's 2 split canvases, which incorporates written poetry and song. The work examines alienation from familial building traditions experienced in displacement. And it truly was an honor for me to work with Deka to create the fragment that would appear as the cover of the book. Engaging artists as a methodological practice of historical scholarship offers a new approach, I think. I think that's an innovation. And rather than relying on maps and drawings from agencies that control migration, I sought expressions in solidarity with open migration. And these consider the Dadaab camps from the perspective of wider planetary ecologies, or put another way, from the earth and from the sky. You may know the work of Cave Bureau, which is a Nairobi architecture firm engaged in a deep, years-long study of caves in the Rift Valley. I asked them if they would be interested in examining the underground cave that sustains life for the refugee camps and has supported the pastoralist grazing lands around it for generations. And so when I first met them, I asked, would you be interested in studying an underground cave filled with water? The reason that Dadaab is even there is because of the Merti aquifer. They made these speculative diagrams of settlements, hardware, and stone to narrate the connection of the camps to this prehistoric interlocking underground cave system, which is a remnant of the Jurassic era, And conversely, as you can see on the top right of this image, they looked at the impact of bore well drilling on the aquifer through its eruption above ground in the water tap stands in the camps. You know, people often narrate Dadaab, people meaning, I guess, policy people in the gray literature, in the news. Dadaab is always the result of protracted crisis. And I always think to myself, this was maybe a revelation or a turning point for me that, you know, coming from the perspective of someone who has built environments, it's not there because of protracted crisis. It's there because it's sitting on a water source that can't be exhausted. So I think that slight shift in narrative makes us look very differently at a place that is only allowed to be seen through the lens of urgency, emergency. So that's maybe thinking with the earth, but thinking with the sky, I turned to work by Elsa M.H. Maki, who is Anishinaabe and Finnish. She's a Native American architect, and she doesn't call herself an architect because she's not licensed yet, but I call her an architect because I'm very glib with that term. But she's the only artist in this group who's peering in from outside of Africa, and I use that word peering quite literally. She was really trying to position the Dadaab refugee camps within a global indigenous politics of resistance, by confronting the act of gazing upon refugee camps from afar, in provincializing this satellite. And she's provincializing the surveillance technology of the satellite that captures visual data on East Africa. So she did a sort of mini history of the Landsat 7, which is that satellite that hovers above East Africa. And using digital drawing techniques, her work examines a satellite survey and image production process, incorporating this text that you see on the screen that comments on artistry and authorship. Her point being that we think of satellite images as a drawing. We think of it, we absorb the idea that it has authorship. Or we don't. We assume that it's somehow a mechanical reproduction and therefore has some sort of objective truth, and we don't understand that it has artistry and authorship behind it. So I'm so grateful for her work for that reason. The core of the study, in a way, were these small works by architect Abdul Fattah Adam. He expresses the larger territories with which Somali people identify. And here he's sort of showing the watery edges of nation states amounting to, you know, so much shading in his watercolor drawing, with Dadaab represented in the ultimate Cartesian abstraction of coordinates, as if in space instead of upon land. The artwork is titled Origins, and it's accompanied by a small text. Some historians claim Somalis are descendants of the pharaohs. Geologists have also claimed the oil deposits in Somalia are greater than any other country in the region, even the Arabian Peninsula. The existence of Dadaab could be attributed to this gift or curse. His work, titled Partitions, concerns a root problem and foundation for all the arguments in the book, and it's, you know, the title of the first chapter is From Partitions. And when I think of my kind of first question, what do we learn when we look closely at a refugee camp? My response is that this architecture is a materialization and an afterlife of partitions. In the book, I examine partitions of the land and partitions of the self as a racial act and architecture of doubling. And I'm following W.B. Du Bois and Achille Mbembe in that thinking. It contributes to larger processes of underdevelopment in Walter Rodney's articulation. And it's my contention that there's work we can do to move away from what I've come to call partition thinking. So I hope my analysis of humanitarian settlement and a knowledge gained through knowing Dadaab takes us in that direction. And I just want to thank you for being here to share this work.
very much. Perhaps. Okay, shall we? Sorry. Yeah. So we can manage the.
Shall we move the Zoom over here? And
Q&A? Perhaps we'll have questions from our audience online and some from our.
Where would you
here.
like me?
I'm not sure. I think you can stand.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Or if you'd like to sit, we can move the laptop very easily.
Yeah, I mean, whatever's, that way people can see.
We can reconvene, around the table and, yes.
This is hello. This.
I think, if you want to be right there.
Yeah, as if they're they can join in the front row.
There are questions.
Yeah, around the table and, yes.
This is hello. This.
I think, if you want to be right there.
Yeah, as if they can join in the front row.
There are questions.
And great.
So I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can also just talk.
See if there's any questions from the online chat. Not yet, but
Hi, I do have a question, if I may.
yes.
Hi, sorry for not showing my face. I'm on the move, so I even couldn't listen to the full presentation, which I'm terribly sorry about. But I jumped in, and at some point you started to speak about a methodological shift in engaging artists in research. And I was just wondering how do you do that? In the sense, do you start collaborations with artists? Do you rely on work that they have already done? Do you have an exchange with them, giving them input, or do you wait? So I'm interested in the operational aspect of this.
I mean, I can tell you how I did it, but I think for everyone, this process is their own. But I mean, I've been working with artists for a very long time, and in Kenya, I was finding myself just meeting lots of artists, and I think some of that was was a little bit of a post-trauma reaction for myself, that I don't like to be around humanitarians anymore. It was really very painful to always be in what is ultimately a very violent system. And I was also, I was mostly researching in humanitarian contexts and in official archives, and they are both violent contexts in different ways. And so at some point, I think I found myself just spending a lot of time in art galleries, in artist residencies with people who were making things and in a way processing their own various, ways of becoming independent through their own work. And so I think the seed bed was laid there, particularly through my colleagues at the Go Down Arts Center, who taught me a lot in a way about this sort of new landscape of the arts in East Africa. But the impetus for this came in a way completely from me and from seeing Deka's work, which I thought so perfectly expressed some of the problems I was trying to get at in a different language. And I think at some point too, I had to sort of select the images, the illustrations for the book, let's call them that. And I thought, I don't want to illustrate this book with a bunch of UNHCR maps. And I, in fact, don't want to illustrate it at all. There's something about the photographs I was taking that to me, they weren't about documenting a place or somehow capturing it. They were really somewhat generative for me. Every single photograph, you won't know this as the reader, but I know this as the writer. Every single photograph is a mnemonic for me. It reminds me of a particular conversation or a particular moment, or it's extreme. They're all very meaningful to me. So it's funny to me to hear other people's impressions of the photographs, because I don't even think they are for other people. But I think that that way of being highly personal and even being artistic in writing a history, which is, you know, counterintuitive, and it goes against the way one is trained, even as an art historian, was a place that I started. At that point, I happened to be able to, I had a little research fund. I happened to be able to approach some artists who I met and architects who I met. I mean, I wouldn't even go so far to say I commissioned their work. I mean, I gave them really a pittance. I gave them my friendship and a pittance for their, what I think was really incredible work that they produced. And I asked them, would you be interested in this idea? And they joined in because they were interested in the idea. That's one person's approach. There are probably many, there are as many ways to do this as there are people who would want to do this.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, please.
I was really interested in thinking about the study of the case that is leading to looking at the there's not just through the lens of emergency, but also as the idea of kind of forming as a result of proximity to the industry. And I wonder if there's a link between that idea of forming as looking at them through the lens of emergency and how that things that are created come back in public space, and the idea of, you know, that you then earlier on talked about the irony and the fact that the only thing that fits is the way people design, the artist kind of designed this kind of replicative and perhaps. So I just wonder if we were looking at perhaps this case of, you know, emergency, have you thought about what might actually be like?
How a place might be designed. I mean, I don't know if it has to be a camp to think about that. There can be ways of thinking from the ground up, you know, in a lot of different contexts. But, you know, the thinking from the perspective of an aquifer, for me, was a way of really thinking about migration and migratory life, and the Rift Valley in particular, where this aquifer is so gigantic, covers so much. You know, I mean, not covers, what would be the word? Undercovers? I mean, it lies beneath such a large swath. There are, my colleague, Robin Davignon has written a really wonderful book about subterranean knowledge in West Africa. And she's writing about artisanal miners, but the ways in which scientific thought in the West, especially on mining, really came from, you know, their interlocutors in West Africa, who, you know, brought some of what we think of as classical scientific knowledge into the world through their own handcrafting and artisanry in those caves. And they are these interlocking caves that, if you imagine how old the continent of Africa is and start to think about deep time in this way, you know, the Kenyans always joke that, you know, we didn't get colonized in the same way because we don't have anything under our earth. We don't have any gold or whatever but I think they do. And as we move into a world where water becomes the thing, we don't have to move there. We're there already. I mean, I just read the other day that the taps in Mexico City have been running dry, even in these very wealthy neighborhoods. I mean, I think we're just hitting this moment. But I think that sitting on an aquifer is going to be a very meaningful thing. And this is again where I feel like in Dadaab, people really teach us, because they know how to live. They don't know how to live because a bunch of humanitarians drilled a bunch of bore wells. They really have lived in this way for a long time, even though they have been so-called confined. There is a kind of generational knowledge on, you know, migration that has passed. I think most people would say, and I again learned this from Decca, who laments her own loss of that knowledge. She goes to visit her grandmother. They all make fun of her because she doesn't know how to walk on the sand anymore with bare feet, and she doesn't know how to make a tukul and all these things. So I met many, you know, doctors, surgeons, lawyers, others from Mogadishu who came to Dadaab and were handed 2 sticks and a cloth and were told to build something, and they had just left their apartments with their satellite dishes, and they of course don't know but everyone has a memory of this, you know, spending summer with their grannies and in the bush and really like having to learn these things as a kid. And I write a little bit in the book about archaeologist Sada Mire writes about how knowing how to build a tuku was what saved our lives during the war, because they knew how to go and live in the bush, or they had somebody in the group would know, or something like that. So I think that those things that, you know, over, you know, generations in the academy, we've been taught to think of as primitive, are the things that we will turn back to now, that we really like, we'll really learn from, not just because they have this strategic utilitarian value, life-saving value, but because they contain knowledge in a very different way, heritage knowledge, like really kind of valuable building traditions that go well beyond the modern at least. But I think that it also helps us to think about time from the perspective of an aquifer. I really think about history also from the perspective of an aquifer. An aquifer is ahistoric, right? It's not a place with written documents necessarily, other than the geologist's reports, which are also among the many archives I gathered for this project. But I do think that what it gives you is it gives you a very different perspective on something you would call emergency. And it is the reason that those camps could be there. It's the reason that an effective apartheid could occur over so many decades. Because if there wasn't a replenishing water source, the politics couldn't happen. So I think that those are the things we need to sort of unpack and think with. I don't know if that gets to your question. It's not an answer that has to do with design. And I think you were asking about design, but if I had to think about design, you know, there's design and there's design, right? The UNHCR will always have these gridded plots, and then people will build what they build. And in Dadaab, they build these, I mean, to my mind, quite heroic structures. The things, the walls that grow out of the ground, the way, it's such a striking environment for anyone. I think anyone who's never been to that part of the world, I think would be, it's so distinct. And so I think, like, if I can think like a very classical art historian for a minute, this is exactly what someone would have just, you know, documented in those ways. And, you know, I can imagine some colonial archaeologists being very excited about a place like this. But I think that there is something about that aesthetic expression that is just as important as all the other ways of building.
Could I follow this up with a quick question? Could you perhaps reflect more about the political meaning of this aesthetics and you know,
Yeah, I mean, maybe most
rather than the art, the art that you're engaging with, yeah, the aesthetics that you actually see them.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, let's say, coding of the environment is that it reads as like huts and shanties, right? If you want to look at it through a lens like that, it reads as utterly provisional. Nothing is a straight line, you know. Nothing but the humanitarian grid is a straight line. Most of the buildings are built from this acacia plant that you can really control its growth. So you can grow fences right out of the ground. You can grow the walls of a structure, and you see a kind of gradation in the camps. The people who live closer to the center, the people who are more wealthy, they still have these kind of acacia structures, but they're often squared walls, or they build in the Makuti style, which is more like a wattle and daub. So it's squared off walls. And the Makuti, you know, one of the things I talk about too are the ways that a tupu is recalcitrant, like it doesn't accept plumbing. A Makuti you can connect it to a plumbing grid, for example, if you wanted to have running water. So you see that gradation in people's building. We could even go back and look at an older image, but you know, toward the periphery or even outside the actual periphery of the camps, you start to see these scattered tupuls, and you see this so-called disorder, right? There's this kind of gridded order, and this is looking from the bird's eye view from above. But I think that so there's all of that kind of gradation, but then there's all of that, what we would call traditional building material that you could then juxtapose with all the humanitarian stuff. Dadaab can also be seen entirely through the tarmacs and the vehicles and the, these vehicles that are fitted with antennas, which is how they are able to do this remote work, the airstrips, the, satellite dishes. There's a real kind of very spectacular technological environment, this infrastructure of the humanitarians. My very first visit to Kenya, we were in a shopping center in Nairobi and all getting our mobile phones. And we were outside the Safaricom shop, and there was a poster showing Safaricom coverage around the country. And the largest circle was around Nairobi, and the second largest circle was around Dadaab, not even Mombasa. So that's also something, there's that kind of transportation communications hub that's there. You have, all the NGOs are also there. I think, in the whole, we could talk about it purely also through the international system. I mean, all the international agencies are represented, not just in Nairobi, but in Dadaab. I also think the presence of Dadaab is because of Nairobi. It's English-speaking country. Nairobi is so easy to get to from Europe. So there's a proximity thing that has enabled it to just be this. It's very different from DRC or these other humanitarian hubs. It's very different, obviously, from South Africa, which is both far from Europe, but also, far in all the ways in that sense. So in East Africa, there was this way that the British government particularly was able to, they in a way didn't miss a beat and just stayed on the ground in these various other forms in the 1960s. So yeah, I think there are those ways of seeing the aesthetics, but I also do think the form of the buildings, and I don't do enough research on that. I've been reading, oh my God, her name has just flown right out of my head. She's an architectural historian who went to West Africa. Anyway, she writes about traditional nomadic dwelling. What is her name? Anyway, I'll think of it when we're talking about something else. But she wrote a really kind of interesting book. Lebel Poussam. She wrote this interesting book on form, and I've been looking at the ways that the form, because she talks also about the tupul in that book. So I've been thinking about the ways that this form both has and hasn't entered the narrative as another way to understand, like, how have its aesthetics brought it into, a colonial sensibility about value in Africa, value in African architecture. How has it made itself known either through the kind of hand labor of making, which is this kind of craft tradition that I think a lot of architects also were interested in looking at. What are the pieces of it that would make it valuable as a craft form and completely valueless as a humanitarian form? And yet it's the exact same object. So those things too, I'm kind of interested in. There's a really, I have a few images in the book that really juxtapose the hand-woven form of the tukul with the form that is made of these recycled scraps that, people have these textiles of the reused grain and flour sacks from the WFP or the UNHCR or whatever. It's a kind of interesting way to think that it is in fact the same kind of making and the same repurposing of materials, but in one case, the material that's being repurposed is an actual plant that has been threshed, and the material that's repurposed in the other case is this concept of imperial recycling that I just really love.
There is a question from Rua online. Rua, if you want to.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the amazing presentation. And I want to go back to the IFO camp sketch
Hmm.
and ask that if the camps were designed by the NGOs and architects this way, is that attempt to turn the camps into formal spaces instead of informal spaces? I believe it might be a tool for control, surveillance, and preventing natural expansion more than a tool of humanitarian or a humanitarian tool.
Yeah, I don't know if those kind of formal, informal, that binary or even that concept is so applicable, but there is a way in which, I mean, I think any kind of very quickly made settlement is made quickly with the idea of controlling a population, and surveillance is one aspect of the control. So that's also that's certainly there, but that would be there in any settlement, not even just a camp. Emergency environments have a real need to be monitored in this way because aid is being distributed. So even if we take the politics out for 1 minute and only look at the humanitarian aid or the kind of the service to the people, that distribution requires a kind of efficiency, and it requires an ability to count a population so that the aid can be requested. You need to request a certain amount. You don't just get it. You have to, there's a whole mechanism of taking the census and counting populations that plays into this. And for that, all of this kind of orthogonal planning is really important to achieve that end. You know, the truth is that the sketch that is drawn is not what's actually on the ground. When people show up, and particularly in a moment of emergency, they plant themselves where they plant themselves. Very sadly for IFO, most people planted themselves in what was already a low-lying basin that then got, further deforested and ultimately succumbed to landslides. It's a relatively flat area, but it's got enough dips that areas have been able to be flooded multiple times. So that's a reason, that has been the reason for the building of new settlements. I'm using scare quotes because I think that ultimately there's so many solutions, and as we're seeing today, if people just trusted people, they would just allow them to self-settle as they wish in the whole country. It's the confining of people that was really headed toward another objective. And I think the UNHCR was utterly complicit in that, and has been. The UNHCR plays this odd role because it has to be friendly to people on multiple sides of borders. So it has to please everyone and thus please no one. And certainly its least accountability in certain ways is to the actual refugees or stateless people who they are ostensibly serving. So, that's another reason, just to back up for a minute and talk about methodology, it's another reason that looking at these things from the perspective of architecture or something that has much more grounded practical concerns, it helps you to see things that you wouldn't see otherwise, because there's a lot of things are made invisible by, the UNHCR is effectively a legal unit. They are also mostly lawyers, the people who work there, and so they, in a way, they don't have these grounded methodologies in the way they work. So when you come with the least bit of an interest in something material, you suddenly start to see a lot of things that wouldn't have even been visible in those classified documents. I did eventually, just to get back to that for a minute, I did eventually get to see documents that had been classified when I started my research. So it was an interesting thing to start to understand, what exactly is reported on. They have a series of documents called SITREPs, which is a situation report. It's literally a military terminology. So I think that also speaks a lot to the humanitarian orientation. And again, this is global humanitarianism or European humanitarianism. This is not mutual aid in the ways that there's a lot of also mutual aid that occurs on the ground in Dadaab. It's not just these stories of empire. And I would say that would probably be the case in any refugee I mean, for all of us who work in these, what are thought of as border area. I mean, I think there is no one in the world who will turn someone away who comes in need. I just genuinely think that. There might be all kinds of politics around you, local politics, global politics, but anytime a group of people show up and they just are desperate and they have children and all these things, the people next door just help. That's just what people do. I think people are just wired to do that. Over time, it can like get messy and protracted, and there can be grievances and things like that, but there's no such thing as this narrative of like needing to separate people, needing to segregate. That's just a fiction, I think. It's not the way that humans relate to each other when it comes down to it. Anybody who has a child will see someone else with another child and they'll just help each other. That's just what happens, I think. I'm using the child, but not to make children this great innocent thing that we all have to worry about. It's anybody in need really helps anyone else, I think. So I think that, you know, some of what we have to do is unravel our own ways of thinking about planning, because planning does come from people trying to kind of have control over public health and hygiene, and people trying to have control over populations. And I don't think that that's the way that the built environment really organically comes up, even in a camp setting.
I think, yes, these are such important points to remind all of us as one who are educating and learning always about our field and try to understand it and to recreate it. So I guess we can end here with in this kind of more optimistic with this more optimistic horizon. There are lots of more questions to be asked, and we can continue the discussion later on. I'm curious about why migration, for example, and not refuge, but we'll discuss these in other opportunities. So thank you so much, Anu, for being with us here today. Professor Siddiqi, and thank you all for coming, and join us again in the future Unfold talks. So
Thank you.
Also thank online as well.
yes.
Wonderful. And I have lots to say about migration and not refuge.
No, my worry is that the doors continue open. We'll just be soon because we kept the bag for a room. So